Okay, friends, you are in for a treat today because I am joined by Dr. Christian Smith, who, in my estimation, has done some of the most important work on understanding millennials and Gen Zers over the past 2 decades. He is a sociologist, written a bunch of books, such as Souls in Transmission, Soul Searching, but has a new book that's out called Handing Down the Faith with his co-author, and correct me if I butcher this, you know what? Just say her name. I'm going to mess it up, Dr. Smith.
Yeah, Amy Adamczyk. She's a colleague at John Jay College in the CUNY system in New York. She lives in Manhattan. She's my co-author.
Outstanding. Well, the book is so fascinating, and we're going to jump into how parents can pass down their faith, church ministers, Christian school educators, really anybody from whatever faith tradition who's concerned about raising up a generation to embrace their faith needs to take note of where the sociological data points. But for my audience, it might be helpful that I wrote a book recently with J. Warden Wallace called So the Next Generation Will Know. And this was kind of a how-to book based on the sociological data. Your book, for clarity, is not so much a how-to, although you offer some practical things at the end. It's more the sociological research about how faith is being passed down effectively and not effectively. Is that accurate?
Yes. It's about how parents, religious parents in the US from different faith traditions, approach the task of passing on faith to their children. And then it
Mm.
brings in other research we've done on sort of what seems to work and what doesn't.
So what makes this book unique compared to some of the other research projects that you've done?
Yeah, in the last a couple decades, we've done a lot of studies of the religious and spiritual lives of teenagers and emerging adults. And what we've learned from that is how important parents are in that process
Mm.
from very early on all the way through into the 20s at least. But then we realized not too many scholars have actually studied the parents themselves. How do the parents approach it? How do they understand their task? How serious are they about it? What kind of things do they try? And so we switched from focusing on the youth to focusing on religious parents. How do they even
Mm.
how do they even approach the whole task? So
Mm.
it's there are a couple other studies that do it that focus on parents, but they have different data and methods. So it's kind of unique in the way we did it.
Well, as a parent of young people, and I teach at a Christian school and speak at a lot of churches, this data really interested me to make sure I'm being effective and wise and smart in how I think about this. Now, one of the things you point out in your book is that the data has not changed since at least the 70s, that parents are hands down the most significant influence in the spiritual lives of young people. And there's a quote you said where it's not their peers, not the media, not their youth groups or clergy, not their religious school teachers. So talk about how that data kind of continues and maybe why you think parents are so significant.
Yeah. So in a way, it shouldn't be at all surprising that
Hmm.
parents are the most important formers of their formation of their children's faith and religious practice. But we have this cultural script that says, once your kids become young teenagers, they stop listening to you as much. They get tuned in to other influences in their life a lot more. And I understand. I've been a parent too. I still am, but my kids were younger before, and I know what it's like to have teenagers, but the fact is that the parents really remain the most important
Mm.
influence for a lot of reasons. If you step back and think about it, it makes total sense. And even though the media, social media, their peers, whatever, can become more important in certain ways, still, under normal circumstances, parents continue, even if they don't know it, even if their kids don't realize it, the parents continue to have really powerful formative effects on their children in every way, including passing on their faith. So once we realized that, like, again, I was part of the myth of like parents stop the matter so much. Once I realized this, it was like, well, we need to really dig into this and understand it better.
You're right, this shouldn't be surprising, but there's a lot of narratives in particular in the community in which I tend to minister the most in the evangelical narrative where we want to blame social media, we want to blame the educational system.
Hmm.
There's so many other things you want to blame, and there is some responsibility and influence there. But when it's all said and done, all of us can look in the mirror first and ask, what are we doing to pass on our faith? That's where the responsibility should lie. And I think your data just continues to show that. Now, we talk about parents. I thought it was fascinating that you discussed differences in the roles and responsibility and potentially the influence of the father and mother. What did this research reveal in that regard?
Yeah, well, in general, and this is something we've known from other research, but in general, it makes a big difference if both parents are invested and involved in sort of
Mm,
the religious formation of their children. First of all, if it's just say like a typical thing might be, it's kind of mom's job, like a division of labor between parents is sort of like, well, mom will take care of that, and then dad, if dad checks out or focuses on other things, that's not nearly as effective as if mom and dad are together, like almost like a united front, like working on this
mm,
together, have a similar approach, aren't at odds with each other about what they're trying to do. That presents children a much more coherent family, all integrated. We're all in on this. This is who we are. This is what we're going to do. The If it's just the mom, that tends to evoke an old Victorian model of, the females are in charge of the hearth and the home and
mm,
morality, and the men go out into the hard, dark world and bring home the bacon. That kind of strong division of labor. And so, what if it's just the mom in charge of religion? What that signals to children, maybe especially to boys, is, well, this they're just doing the standard cultural thing, and this is just about morality or ethics, and dad isn't really into this so much, and that really communicates, okay, I'll do this to learn my basic morality, but then when it's done, especially if I'm a guy, I'll go on and do other things. Whereas if
mm.
the father's invested, that's virtually, it's a mildly countercultural statement. Like, no, this is for all human beings. This is for everybody in our family, that this is who we are. This is what we're doing. So, fathers, I would say, matter especially.
Hmm. Now, you cite and interact with the work of Vern Bankston at USC,
Hmm.
and his book,
Hmm.
also published with Oxford on faith and families, studied, I think, 3,500 people, 4 generations over about 35 years.
Hmm.
And the sociological factor they found most significant is a warm relationship with the father.
Yeah.
And well, part of my question is there something, or maybe this goes beyond what the sociological data can reveal, is there something about the father, whatever that is different, or is it just that the parents are on the same page that makes the difference?
Um, Sociologically, I think we can just say for sure that it's being on the same page that makes a difference. I would add, we'll get to this later, but if children have troubled relationships with either parent, that
Mm,
that becomes sort of a wrench in the machine here. But if children have an especially warm relationship with the father, or let me back up and say this, it's more likely that children have a warm relationship with their mother. Now, it's not taken for granted, but it's more likely.
makes
And then
sense.
if they also have a warm relationship with their father, then they're going to be in a pretty good situation with regard to being
Mm,
able to relate to their parents. So this is stereotypical, but there's truth to it. There are a certain amount of fathers who are just busy at work or who are sort of cold and distant. And if it's not like that, that really creates a sort of an environment that's really optimal for getting children to buy into what the parents care about.
well, since you hinted at it, let's jump into it right now. Is there uh, a negative effect on faith transmission from divorce in your research? Because I remember in Vern Bankston's, again, his research said divorce is strongly correlated, and I forget the exact numbers, with a lack of faith transmission in terms of a kid believing the same thing in terms of faith tradition as the parents. So there's a negative correlation that's there with divorce or strong discord in the home. Did you find the
Yeah,
same data?
yeah, sure. I mean, this is absolutely the case, and
Mm,
it's pretty strong. No, it's tricky because this is something parents just can't choose or decide. a lot of this can be out of parents' control, and it's not even just divorce. Somebody, a parent could have become a drug addict, or they could be in prison, or they could be
Mm,
mentally ill, or they could have died. So a lot of households don't have moms and dads in them. So just to acknowledge that. And even so, religious parents that we interviewed still do their very best to deal with it. But the truth is that the most likely family structure to turn out children who continue on as adults to be the
mm,
religion that they were raised in have mom and dad, uh, um, two biological, especially parents in the home. And so if you think about a single parent situation, it's not just that that's less likely to turn out children who are more religious. The single parent themselves is less likely to be religious for various reasons. Sometimes they feel guilty for having been divorced. Sometimes, rightly or wrongly, they feel unwelcome in a church. They feel like they're
mm.
being judged. I've heard stories of single moms who pick up the vibe from married women in churches that they're somehow a threat because maybe they'll be interested in their husband. So there's also
Mm.
single parents, I think, are just by Sunday morning, they're more tired, they're worn out, they
Sure,
need to do
sure.
laundry. So there's a lot of reasons that are understandable why. If you have two parents who are together in this, like as a team, you're much more, they're much more
Mm.
capable not only to be involved in a church, say, but to work with their kids in that way. So yeah, divorce, single parents, never married, widowed, etc. All those are less effective sort of family structures to work with.
Thank you for that just kind of qualification that raising this data is not to like shame or embarrass or make
Yeah.
somebody feel bad. That's the furthest thing. I have a number of friends whose spouses left them and they did not want the marriage to end and it was out of their
Hmm.
control and it's painful. And yet the
Yeah,
data
and
is,
in general,
yeah.
along those lines, I would say, I think that the story of our research should be empowering to parents. It's easy for parents.
Mm,
Again, so stepping back, parenting is really hard. Like if you're a parent, you know that
amen.
it's sometimes it's harder than others. So there's no sense of judgment or you should be doing this in any of this. Really, I would like parents to feel like, hey, we still matter. We still have some influence. We still
Mm.
make a difference. And so I hope parents hearing this feel empowered and not judged, and including single parents to feel like, well, I don't have all the sociological factors lined up behind me, but there's still a difference I can make.
That's right. I think knowing what is true, then we can respond accordingly given the circumstances we happen to find ourselves in. And
Yeah.
you present a lot of that data that's really helpful. So,
Yeah. I may be jumping ahead, but it
okay.
relates to this, and that is two parents is really valuable, but it's also grandparents can also make a difference. Aunts and uncles can also make a difference. Bring Building relationships with cousins can also make a difference. So more extended kin can't necessarily substitute for a mom and dad, but can still be significant family factors in all this.
Yeah, that was great. I saw that in Vern Bankston's studies as well, and I shared it with my parents. I was like, hey, you guys are really significant in the faith transmission of your
Hmm.
grandkids. And it was neat to see your data support that as well for
Hmm.
different reasons we won't get into. People are living longer, it's easier to move and live closer together. But those biological connections are very, very significant. Now, as
Hmm.
a whole, how important is faith transition to most parents? And by most parents, let's just take your typical American parents. And then I'd be curious if there's
Hmm.
any data that came out in terms of more conservative or evangelical parents that you found.
Right. So we can take all parents in the US and roughly divide them into thirds. About a third of American parents aren't religiously connected and really don't care about this stuff. About a third are marginally, they have some religious identity. Maybe they go to religious services now and then. I would say it's still not a really big deal for them that their kids, pass on the faith. And then the final third are parents who actually are members of a religious community. They have significant beliefs, they practice their faith, and it means something to them. So for about a third, maybe off to a quarter, but let's just say a third of American parents, this stuff matters, and they care what their kids end up believing and how they end up identifying
Hmm.
religiously. So when we interview teenagers for the National Study of Youth and Religion, they weren't so articulate, and they were a little bit ho hum about this, and we came away like, oh boy, wow. But when we interviewed the religious parents, and again, we only interviewed this study, we only interviewed parents who had some connection to a religious congregation. Some
Okay.
of them we intentionally sampled to be really involved parents, and another like 40% we intentionally sampled to be less involved. We didn't want to just get all the stars of a congregation, right? We wanted some mix. So the point of that being, we came away from talking with all of the parents actually quite impressed with how uh, much they cared about this. You know, a lot of times they felt overwhelmed or a little bit at sea, but they actually cared about this, and they had thought about it, and they had some strategies for carrying this out. So
Hmm.
to summarize, it's a minority of American parents who really care about this,
Hmm.
but that minority is an impressive group.
Hmm. Well stated. Now, one of the terms that you coined that I found super helpful is moralistic therapeutic deism.
Hmm.
And that's an entire topic that we could have about how Americans across religious commitments tend to approach God. You have a similarly super helpful comparison here. The phrase might not be as catchy and as memorable for people, but you describe the difference between a personal identity accessory and a communal solidarity project in terms of how people approach the role of religion. And this was very eye opening and clarifying for me.
Hmm.
Please explain what you mean by those terms and why it's so significant.
Yeah, so I started off here trying to think about why is it so much responsibility these days falls on the shoulders of parents? My
Hmm.
sense and my sense of religious history is that in the past, there have been more actors involved in religious transmission. It hasn't all just been sort
Mm-hmm.
of falling on the shoulders of parents. And so I started thinking sociologically across time, like what has changed across the 20th century in American religion? And the technical way we scholars would put it is, how do Americans conceive of the social ontology of religion? That is, what do they think religion is? How does
Mm-hmm.
it fit into the larger social order? And so to try to make sense of this, it's simplistic, but I hope it's illuminating. And that is, I thought, you know, in the first half of the 20th century, religion was more like, as you mentioned, a community solidarity project. It's something people did together. It was based in congregations. It was a strong part of people's identities. It was there. The clergy were more involved. If you were Catholic, you know, Catholic school, all kinds of actors would have been more involved in this. People would have lived. It would have been more neighborhood centered, especially depending on your ethnicity. You may have lived in actually an urban working class ghetto, and it, simply being a part of that community, being growing up in that community, would have helped to form you in your faith, in your identity, in your commitments. I think what's happened in the second half of the 20th century, due to suburbanization, upward socioeconomic mobility, growing individualism, and a lot of other factors, is that religion has shifted. I'm not saying this is the way it really is. I'm saying this is how Americans conceive of it culturally. Religion has shifted from being that community solidarity project to being something more like a personal identity accessory. That is, it's another piece of life. Like the basic unit of society
Mm.
is now the individual. Individuals are up in the project of sort of defining themselves, who they are, and what they're going to be as individuals. And there's a lot of pieces that go into defining a self, of which religion is only one. There's also, you know, you name it, politics, sexual identity, you know, region of the country, all sorts of interests. And religion is just one little kind of plug in. You plug in and you plug out. And so as young people are forming their identities, religion is an accessory. Like when you order a new car, you can say, well, I
Mm.
want it to have this kind of computer or screen or a moonlight, you know, all kinds of accessories. I
Wow.
think people increasingly view religion like it's another accessory you may or may not order for your personal identity over time. And so when kids are growing up in religious families, instead of being in an entire environment that says, this is who we are, this is our people, this is our history, this is our tradition, it's kind of like, well, I'm forming my sense of myself, and do I want religion to be part of it or not? Well, if that's the case, you have to read the book to get this whole story. But if that's the case,
Yeah.
that helps to explain why so much responsibility falls on parents, because the locus of activity shifts from the congregation or the neighborhood to the household.
Mm.
And churches, say, are just an hour or two once a week for most people. They just plug in and plug out. They kind of, it's a hub and spoke system where they go in, do the thing, and then leave. But where the kids are most of their life, other than school and sleeping, is at home interacting with parents. So that just put, if that's true, that just helps to explain why parents have such a big influence, and other factors that maybe traditionally had more influence no longer do. But I think it also provides a big picture sort of reading of how our culture and society have changed in terms of what is Christianity in that, what is the church in that, to help understand sort of the terrain everyone's trying to traverse.
Well, to me, that was one of the most illuminating parts of your book because you're taking a massive sociological shift over decades and arguably even centuries, and saying,
Mm-hmm.
in some ways, we can sum it up by saying religion was approached as conforming myself to an external authority, namely the
Yes.
community, maybe scripture, maybe traditions. So
Mm-hmm.
I fit an external truth. Now, religion is viewed as just one product, almost in a consumer fashion, along
Yes.
with other products of my life, which means it really has no authority apart from the self.
Yeah, the individual's the authority conforming their own self with the help of parents, hopefully. So you shift from being a community identity based thing to a marketplace based
Mm.
dynamic where people are consumers based on their preferences are deciding, here's what I want or don't want. It's a totally different way of understanding religion.
So, this would in turn shape the way we think about truth. Is truth internal to my preferences and my likes, what I want to consume, versus external to me? And that, at classically, in the way you define a communal solidarity project, the idea would be, even across religions, there's a truth outside of me that we discover and conform to. Now, religion would not even be seen largely through that same lens.
Mm-hmm.
Truth is found on my experience and my preferences. So, if that's an accurate summary, and it seems that it is of what you're saying, how do most parents approach the idea even of religious truth itself?
Yeah, it's very tricky. As you know, and many of your viewers here know, things have changed over a period of time where the very notion of sort of an authoritative truth external to the self is sort of gone away. So
Mm.
the general culture has a sense that there's no capital T truth for everyone. I mean, sort of postmodernism, post structuralism, a lot of intellectual and cultural forces and technologies, frankly, cable television and internet have gotten rid of this idea that there's any truth that binds us all together. So
Mm.
parents operating in that kind of context have got to navigate the waters between, on the one hand, a total relativism, like, oh, this is totally arbitrary what I believe, like you could do anything, that's, and nobody knows, like that's a far extreme that's really not going to work for anybody. And on the other far extreme, sort of like, this is the absolute capital T truth, everyone else is totally wrong, if you don't do this you're living in total darkness. That most parents are not going to go there either, right? So parents are aware of all this at some level. And so the way it oftentimes gets worked out, and it showed up in the teenagers we interviewed too earlier, was this sort of like, well, this is what we believe is the truth, this is who we are. It's not quite a relativistic truth for me, truth for us, but it isn't a strong claim to truth. Usually it's sort of like, here's who we are, here's who I want us, here's where we are in the world, here's who we want to be, here's who I hope you will be, without making too many strong claims about the larger sort of
Mm.
metaphysical groundings of those truths. I would say evangelicals um, are more likely to say, no, we really believe this is the truth. Like this is
Yeah.
universal. This is for everybody. But there's a much less harder edge than I would say earlier in the 20th century, or in mid 20th century. There's much more of a sort of an openness to, people that disagree. That's not our business to worry too much about. This is God will sort that out in the end. But we really do believe Scripture teaches X, Y, and Z. Scripture is the
Mm-hmm.
authoritative truth of God. Or in American Catholicism, there's infinitely much less sense of like, the church teaches it, that's authoritative. Uh, that's been gone for a while.
Huh.
So it's a tricky, it's a tricky mm, cultural situation for people that do believe something is true to try to communicate that to young people without coming off as totally closed-minded and idiotic
Yeah.
and imperialistic and judgmental and all these things with without on the other hand just jumping into total relativism like, well, it could be anything, who knows. So I know for a fact from interviewing teenagers over many years, like that's a big struggle. They don't know how to put that together. Parents, I think, have more maturity to try to communicate that. But my concern sociologically is I think in the end, when if teenagers think at all about it, they really come away saying, well, my parents do that because that's how they were raised. If I do it, it's because of how I'm raised, but could could be anything really.
Hmm.
It's just whatever you're comfortable with.
I think you're right that this is a struggle, and it's an intellectual struggle in part, which is why I spend a good amount of time talking about, is there such a thing as truth? Can we know truth? What is truth? Can
Mm-hmm,
truth be found in religion the way people assume in science? But it's also an emotional struggle because they know
mm-hmm,
people intimately daily who see the world in a different fashion, and
mm-hmm,
religious truth has implication for their relationships with them and their destiny. So being sensitive to those dynamics is really, really important. What you're saying. What
mm-hmm.
what other challenges did you come across that parents face in passing on their faith today?
Yeah, universally, and we interviewed not just Christian parents, but also, Buddhist, Hindu, uh, Muslim, Mormon, Jewish, lots of kinds of parents, religiously. Universally, parents are really feel caught in a dilemma between, on the one hand, they want to do as much as they possibly can. The more religious parents want to do as much as they can to
Sure.
form their children, to pass on the faith, to model, and so on. But they're also aware, this relates to what we just talked about. They're also aware that there's a danger if they cross a line where they're pushing too hard, that their kids will rebel. So, or this is what they think, or this is what they fear. So there's this, the standard phrase is, you don't want to shove it down their throats because then they'll spew it back out to you and say, forget it. But parents also don't want to be totally lackadaisical, hands off. So parents, the more, and especially the more parents are invested in this, continually trying to figure out, okay, do I push this? Do I ask that? Do I demand that? Do I say this? Or will that be too much? Will that turn them off? And again, it's like a strategic choice. How far, it's almost like a game of chicken. How far can you go to be most effective without becoming counterproductive? That's just like a universal fear of parents, not to shove it down their
Hmm.
throats to provoke rebellion.
Hmm. That's interesting. The other one I hear regularly is social media is a constant challenge. How to
Yeah.
navigate that well. Now, this next question I have for you starts to suggest certain things that parents should do who want to hand down their faith. Now, we're not yet to
Mm-hmm,
the prescriptive part, but you
mm-hmm.
talk about kind of four different dimensions of parenting style and which one is most closely associated with faith transmission. Talk about that, if you will.
Yeah, so I mean, the baseline here is parents who are more committed and involved in their faith are more likely to pass on to their children, right? So that's one factor. But in addition to that, and interacting with that, is this whole question of parenting styles. So in psychology of parenting, there's this idea of parenting styles, and The idea is there are four different types of parenting styles, and they're defined by two different dimensions. One dimension is whether the parent is warm and open and close to their child versus cold
Okay.
and distant. The other dimension is whether the parent has standards and expectations and makes demands of the child, and that there are consequences for the children's behavior, versus laissez faire, you do whatever you want. I'm not going to get involved in your choices and decisions. So, the most effective parenting style is called authoritative, not authoritarian, authoritative.
Mm.
And that's the one that combines warm, affectionate, emotionally bonded with high expectations, high demands, and consequences for behavior. So the parents are emotionally connected to the children, but they also expect things from their kids. They let their kids know, here's how we live, and here's what you can and cannot do. Not just in religion, in everything, in grades, in risk behaviors, in success in the future. Those kind of parents raise kids who are more likely to succeed or carry on what the parents want. Authoritarian parents uh, have high expectations and demands and behavioral demands, but they're cold and distant from their kids.
Mm.
There's a lot of religious parents like that, but that's less successful in passing on faith.
Mm.
And then the other kinds are parents either who are cold and distant or who are warm and bonded, but they don't expect anything. The kids are
Sure.
on their own, and neither of those work well at all for
Interesting.
passing on faith, because the kids are like, my parents don't care either way how I live. It's
Yeah.
up to me. So they just and if a kid says it's up to me, rarely do they say, okay, then I'll go to church weekly. That's not what they're going to choose.
Uh,
So in addition to just how religious the parents are, religiously committed, the quality of the relationship what they have with their children independently matters too in this way.
I was not surprised by this data, but I was thrilled to see it because it supports how my parents raised me, and my father's been researching for years. And one of the phrases he coined is rules without relationships leads to rebellion.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and his point was we need rules. Like you said, it communicates love, gives kids boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
but it
Mm-hmm.
must be in the context of relationships that are warm and loving. That's the formula for lack of a better term, that faith is best transmitted through. And I love that your data just showed that. In many ways, it's common sense, but it's important for the data
Yeah, yeah.
to
And as
be
any
there.
parent knows, you don't just set expectations and standards for socially control your kids. You do it because you love them. So
That's right.
uh, it's good for them, and sometimes it's
Mm.
hard to do that. But so when parents don't have relationships, when they're cold and distant, then it communicates. Well, the rules are just I'm here to control you, or
Mm.
to protect my reputation, some other bad motive.
How important is religious service attendance in terms of faith transmission?
It matters. It matters a lot. I mean, it's one of the top four, I would say, sociological factors you can identify.
Mm-hmm.
Importance of faith, like subjectively to the parents. Religious attendance is another one. So if parents attend regularly with their kids, that sends a strong message, and those kids are most likely to grow up. They're the most likely of all to grow up doing the same thing. You could put it negatively. If parents say, oh, yeah, my faith is really important, it's like, well, why don't we ever go to church? Yeah, there's a contradiction there. So that matters. It's not the most important. I would say even more important, and maybe you wanted to talk about this, is parents talking with their kids at home during the week about things. But certainly, sort of consistent religious service attendance matters. Also, being involved in the church beyond just the one, say, worship service a week. Those parents who are involved in something else during the week, that's another independently significant factor.
Mm.
And again, it's an indicator of commitment, investment, care, um, to be a Christian or whatever the faith is.
Yeah, I think what comes through so clearly in your data is that what parents find important, and not just what they
Mm-hmm.
say, but how they spend their time, how they spend
Mm-hmm.
their money, their energy, what they talk about, communicate to the next generation what is important and what they will more likely than not adopt. And of course, as a Christian, I look at things like in the Old Testament, the Shema, And before it gives commands how to pass on your faith, so to speak, it says, love Lord God with your heart, your soul, mind, your strength, which kind of says what adults tend to love and care about and invest in is going to be most likely what the next generation loves and cares and invests in. And that's one of the big principles that just comes through in your data. Now, you hinted at this, so I'd love to have you unpack it. So you say religious attendance is important, one of the top four, but sociologically speaking, even more important are the conversations that parents have with their kids. So what
Mhm.
kinds of conversations are you talking about?
Yeah, so I think it can be different. There isn't one standard kind of conversations, and of course, different parents have different personalities and styles and so on. But the underlying idea is when parents raise questions or just for conversation discussion during the week, driving in the car, over the dinner table, whatever, with their kids, somehow relating their religious faith to something else going on in life. Um, that makes a huge difference. The contrast is when parents, we go to church, we say this stuff, we sing the hymns, we go home and never talk about it again. That is
Mm,
really not very, again, that sends this signal. It's just this little tiny compartment of life.
yep.
Whereas if parents talk about it with their kids during the week, it sends the signal, this really matters to me. I'm thinking about this. I care about this. It also is a potential way for parents and children to strengthen their relationship in a way, in other dimensions. Um, and it gives children a chance to sort of think and talk about religious faith themselves. So, what kind of conversations? I think open, honest, authentic, uh, questioning, sharing conversations are the ones that are going to be effective. If it's just the parent saying, "Okay, everybody, put down what you're doing. I'm going to tell you some truth from the catechism," or not that I'm against catechism, but I'm going to tell you
Sure.
the truth, some truth, or just preaching or authority that doesn't fit in the sort of the normal flow of life. I don't think the kids are going to be weirded out by that. So, again, I think it always goes back to what you were just saying, authenticity. This is actually who we are. This is actually what we care about.
Hmm.
And in some ways, you can't make this stuff up. It's like, it'll just
That's right.
happen if that's who you are, and kids are smart, parents know this. Like, if you try to pretend, if you try to
Hmm.
say, well, I just realized they wanted you to become a Methodist when you grow up, so I guess I should start acting like that. That's not going to work. Pretending inauthenticity. So it really is just a matter of we'll get what we are, we'll get who we are in the end.
Sometimes we as parents and other people who care about the next generation can get caught up in like what methods do we use to pass on the faith. A lot of your data says, you know what, if we just look within and say, how am I spending my time? What do I care about? How am I living my life? What
Mm-hmm.
do I love? That's
Mm-hmm.
the essential question, because if
Right.
we're committed and living it out, it's going to kind of bubble over, so to speak, and kids
Mm-hmm.
will pick up on that. Now, I wrote a blog just a couple weeks ago based on reading your book and some thoughts I've had for a while, and it stirred up a little bit of conversation. It was just simply why I don't have family devotionals. And of course, I was writing to my Christian audience, and the point was not that other families shouldn't, but that in my family growing up, and I think my parents were successful at this. And what the data shows is the most significant points of faith transition are not so much the formal times, but the regular, informal conversations that
Mm-hmm.
people have. Does your data, and I think you've kind of answered this, support that approach as a whole?
Yeah, here's what I would say. We didn't ask specifically about do you do devotions, and some
Mm,
families do, and some don't, and some do it more or less informally or infrequently. But I think the answer is what you just said.
hmm,
If the whole expectation is half an hour of week a daily devotions is going to be the religious time and the rest of life turns quote unquote secular, that's not going to be effective. Like, it's got to be the whole of life. And the flip side of that would be parents can talk to their kids and model for their kids while they're fishing, while they're grocery shopping, and while they're on the sideline of sports, like just in ordinary life, while they're tired at home cleaning. uh, Whether or not there's formal devotions, I would say, is immaterial to that one way or another. What matters is
interesting.
the bigger who are we? What do we love? What are we committed to? What do we invest in?
Hmm.
So I wouldn't knock devotions unless
Yeah,
they were stilted and awkward. That's
good.
not going to be helpful.
So I do some formal things with my kids. We go to church. I send my kids to a Christian school. There's certain conferences I send my kids to, like Summit Ministries. Formal things can play a role. And I had a lot of parents write me and say, hey, we do devotions and they work for us. And I was like, awesome, go
Hmm.
for it. Just
Hmm.
don't be led to think that a formal 30-minute period a week and nothing else that you do is the solution to pass on your
Hmm.
faith. That's what
Hmm.
I was pushing back again, and I think your
Yeah.
data shows. Now, I'm really curious. You didn't talk about this a ton, but did the data reveal anything significant about faith transmission for same-sex parents?
We uh, we interviewed a number of same-sex households. We didn't sample
Hmm.
enough in order to really draw solid conclusions, but we wanted to talk with enough to have some sense of things. I would say what I can conclude is based on the same-sex parents that we interviewed, just that their concerns, their investments, their worries, their hopes are very similar to heterosexual
Hmm.
parent households. They're not somehow radically different, which is what I would expect. But I can't. We don't have data to the effect of are their kids more or less likely to turn out uh, more or less religious when they grow up. I don't know that anyone has done that study.
Hmm.
That would be affected by the fact that the vast majority of same sex households are going to be in liberal Protestant churches. They're not going to be in evangelical or
Sure.
Catholic churches unless they're hiding somehow.
Sure.
And we also know that parents in mainline liberal Protestant churches are the least likely to pass on their faith to their children. So mainline
Hmm.
Protestantism is not great at this, but that would be an effect of the tradition, not the individual parents, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, that does. Oh, keep going.
Yeah, I'm just going to say nobody has really studied that well. It's
Hmm.
difficult methodologically. It should be becoming easier, but no, I can't say anything definitively about that.
That's fair. That's what I was hoping to know, where the data
Mhm.
points right now.
Mhm.
I'd be curious where you think further research can be done that would be interesting. Like for me, the question of same sex parents would be interesting to know how they pass in their faith. Is it similar, different, the effectiveness? Also, the question we hinted at earlier, is there a way to isolate the role of the father distinct from the role of the mother? Is there a way to know that question? Are there any other areas that sparked your interest you'd love to see further research probe into moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some cases, like we've talked about the ideal situation. Two biological parents, they're both on the same page, they're a united front. Okay, well, a lot of households aren't like that. So
Hmm.
if we were to explore, what about single parent house or household where the father or mother is a different religion or just doesn't care? Under those particular kind of circumstances, that is, you drill down to more particular situations, what other factors can fill in, so to speak,
That's
or can
great.
substitute? So we got a hint of this studying the Catholic school effect. For the most part, Catholic schools don't have an effect on forming kids over and above the effect of their
Wow.
parents,
Wow.
except there again, that goes back to the parents, except there's a small subset, it appears, where parents who aren't that religiously involved do send their kids to Catholic schools, and then the Catholic schools for them can kind of fill in some.
Hmm.
As a general rule, that doesn't happen. Other forces do not override, like the parents set a glass ceiling above which other factors don't work. But I do believe that there must be certain situations or contexts where a youth minister of the right kind, or a religious school of the right kind, or a grandparent or an uncle and aunt can make a difference. That when you analyze that across the big national data, that kind of gets washed out or it gets lost in the shuffle, so to speak. But if we drill down to particular contexts and situations that actually really matter, we might learn more details that are important.
I would love to know that as somebody who speaks and writes to single parents, some who've been divorced,
Mhm.
some who never were married in the first place or lost a spouse, the effectiveness of congregations filling that role, of
Mhm.
Christian schools. That's interesting. You've done the research on Catholic schools, but I'd love to know the range of religious schools, especially including evangelical ones, to have that data to back up helping the parents, which seems to be increasing, that care
Hmm.
about their kids deeply and want to know what can they do to hand down their faith. So that sounds like a
Yeah.
great research
Another
project.
another one real quick. I'm not
Yeah.
going to do it, but I think you and a lot of people would love to see this, and that is, my impression is in youth ministries, in churches, there are some youth ministers who are very good at working with parents, building relationships with parents. It's sort of a team, a tripart team effect: parents, youth ministry, teenagers. There are other youth ministers who sort of become real good friends with the teenagers and kind of alienate the parents, like, oh, they're not good enough
Mm,
Christians, and sort of the youth minister actually creates a rift, but that they
wow.
benefit from between the teen and the parent. And what I would like to know is if you could create samples of both of those, the difference it makes in the strategy of a youth minister to bring the parents on board and to have them, or actually the parents are the ones who are running the show, but to get the youth minister to sort of work with the parents to help move things along instead of creating, sort of the parents as the bad guys, what kind of difference that makes. Because I think there's just as much potential for youth ministers to do harm as to do good, given the importance of parents, depending on how they relate to parents. I don't know anyone that's studied that.
I would love that data because when we ask the question of the effectiveness of congregation, it depends on how often we go, depends on if
Hmm.
they have a youth ministry, don't have a youth ministry, the kind of youth minister, so many factors. So if I heard you correctly, you were saying that you would be a doctoral supervisor for somebody who wants to do this research.
Well, at the very least, I would let somebody else steal that idea and capitalize on it.
That's awesome. I just want to second that that data would be very helpful. So keep encouraging people to go that route and find
Hmm.
that out. Did anything surprise you? And I got to tell you, I've read a lot of your research in the past, and it felt like a big confirmation looking at it from the angle of parents of what I would have suspected. There weren't a ton of things that just surprised me that I stopped. I'm like, oh my goodness. Partly because I've just been researching these kind of things
Hmm.
for so
Hmm.
long in other similar studies. But was there anything that just surprised you, that caught you off guard in the data in terms of how parents pass on their faith?
Yeah, I mean, most things made sense, just like to you, they made sense to me. And actually, I much prefer to find things that make sense. It's sort of like, okay, we weren't crazy, like the world isn't insane.
Yeah.
But that can not just confirm it, but really back it up and give us a way to understand it. One thing that came out that was a puzzle that I don't quite know how to put together, and that is what I describe as a mismatch between what parents want from religious congregations, or what they say they want from religious congregations for their kids, and my impression of what sort of official church people, clergy, pastors, ministers, youth ministers. Uh, Parents mostly said what they want from their churches, their religious congregation, is a warm community, some friends for their kids, some positive programming, no major problems, like nothing that are going to make their kids just hate it. Um, but it was very kind of this worldly, so to speak, like just
Mm,
a nice community, maybe some nice music, but basically some place where their kids would be happy to go. Uh, my impression is a lot of people that have been through seminary and so on, they think they're there for doctrine and liturgy and catechesis and Sunday school, like training and discipleship and so on. And that's not what the parents said they're interested in.
mm,
Now maybe the parents have more interest in that. When we were just talking about their kids, it didn't come out, but I just have a sense that there's kind of a passing two ships
yeah.
passing in the night when when parents show up to church, and maybe more than parents, what they're there for may be very different from what the church people think they're offering people, or what they're there for. And if so, maybe that works, but my style of living is, I think, maybe it'd be good for them to talk and say, what are we doing here? What are we trying to accomplish in church? And see
Mm,
if they can get on the same page. Maybe that would create conflict. I don't know, but it seems like it'd
mm.
be worth it was just what I heard parents saying, what they wanted just seemed different from what I know clergy and ministers and so on think that they're there for.
You and I are looking at this through a little bit of a different lens. You being a sociologist, I've taught at a Christian school part time and full time, 10 years full time, now part time, just one class in Southern California. And it's an evangelical Christian school. And to me, the heart of a Christian school is to like, let's pass on the faith. Let's raise up young
Hmm.
people who can think Christianly. And yet, not all, but a lot, probably a majority of parents who come are asking, how good is your sports program? What size is
Yeah.
classrooms? Is it safe? Do kids get into
Hmm.
college? And it's the same kind of thing you're suggesting for religious congregations. There may be a mismatch between expectations of people. So that's really interesting. The data showed that about churches as well. Now,
Hmm.
if I was going to say, all right, Dr. Christian Smith, I want you to come to speak to a group of parents. What are 2 or 3 points you would make drawn from your data? And you get into this in the back of your book, and I appreciate that you're saying I'm a sociologist. I'm trying to analyze the data. What you do with this is up to you, but you also say the data suggests certain things that parents could do. What
Hmm.
are maybe 2 or 3 things you say to parents? Do this, and insofar as you can, try to not do this
Hmm.
if you care about handing down your faith.
Yeah. So they're not rocket science. They're pretty straightforward. The first is sort out your own life. Like, what do you really care
Mm,
about? What are your real commitments? Don't even think about your kids. Just think about who am I? What am I invested in? The second thing is to be intentional. Don't just let, life is busy. People have crazy schedules. It's very easy to wake up and the kids are older and it's all, that's over. I would say be intentional, give it some thought, really think how would I like my kids to look 10, 20 years from now? And what's going to happen now that could lead to that? And
it's
don't just
great.
let that get pushed off to the side. I would say be authentic. Like it's going to come through anyway. Like just talk to talk to your like the big thing, having these conversations we discussed. Have some real authentic conversations. If you don't totally get everything, you can say that. You can say, well, let's go get the answer to that somewhere. Or if you have doubts, I mean, I wouldn't lay all kinds of doubts all over a 12-year
Sure.
old, but at some point, I think it's better to say, I wrestle with these things. And then the
Mm,
kid realizes, wow, this is real life. Like this is something that people really struggle with, and they care about it enough to wrestle with it, as opposed to just giving some formal, quick, easy answer. So I think being authentic um, really matters. And then I would say, and this matters on its own, but especially for this, like build good relationships with your kids as much as you
mm,
can. Invest in resolving conflicts, resolving trouble, like clearing up bad feelings. It being, different people are different, do this differently, but express love, express care, be open to share. Again, it just goes back to the thing you said maybe 25 minutes ago. If parents love something and they have a good relationship with their kid, that will really tend to rub off on their children.
mm. That's great. You're right. It's not rocket science. Look within at your own life, your priorities, how you're living, build a relationship with the kid, have fair expectations, real conversations, not
Mm-hmm.
lectures. That's the formula, for lack of a better term, if you want to put
Mm-hmm.
yourself in a position to hand down your faith. Now, this just occurred to me. One of the questions that I get a lot is from parents who have tried to do these things. Sometimes parents
Mm-hmm.
didn't do these things and they have regret and say, where were you 10, 20 years ago? Or they'll
Mm-hmm.
say, I try to do these things and my kids
Mm-hmm.
are not following in the faith. Are you aware of
Mm-hmm.
any data of parents who find themselves there and try to go back and engage their kids? What would you suggest? And I realize this might be out the realm of the data you've
Mm-hmm.
done, so just speak from however you want to. Is there any data on this or advice you might know for parents who find themselves in that situation?
Yeah, this was actually one last point I wanted to really drive home, and that is,
Oh, good.
although I've been emphasizing the importance of parents, it's really, really important to also realize it's not, this is not determinism. Parents can't
Mm,
control their kids. Their kids are their own people. Um, there are no guarantees in any of this. And, maybe you and I in our own families, or I think most parents know they're the same household, they're the same parents, different kids in the same family turn out quite differently. So none of this is guaranteed. As a sociologist, I'm really talking about broad generalizations and tendencies. And those are really true, but I don't want, and again, I would rather be empowering parents than making them feel bad that, well,
Mm.
I did these things and my half of my kids didn't turn out the way. Well, all parents can do is their job, and then it's beyond them, right? So, um, there are, to answer your question, so that's the general context. To answer your
It's great.
specific question, I don't know of any studies of parents, who
Hmm.
wish they could have done something differently or they did. And I think we would probably just fall back on common sense about relationships, where it's not just passing on the faith, but anything. It's always possible, or hopefully it's always possible, for parents to go back to children and say, I realize I blew this, or I
Hmm.
wish I would have done that differently. Every decent parent has got to have those thoughts. So again, but that's just part of an ongoing, authentic, bonded relationship with children, to the extent that that's possible, and working things out. If there are children who grow up with something really bothering them about church that happened or whatever, if that can be resolved, that could only help.
Hmm.
Yeah, there are some people who 30 years after some insult happened at a wedding in their church, they're still carrying that around. They're mad at the pastor that he said X, Y, or Z, and that's why they won't go to church. So the more things can get resolved, the more people can sort of reconcile or help get over difficult things. It seems like even as adults, adult children, that can make a positive difference. Because again, the model that, well, you're a parent until 18, then it's all over. I mean, that's not true either. Most parents continue relating and want to their children. So all of this can carry on. There's going to be less influence in the future. They're going to be adults, maybe have a spouse, they're their own, but children. But it's worth working on.
That's great encouragement. Just owning where we've fallen short, experiencing grace, and just trying to restore that relationship in appropriate, healthy way, step by step, is
Mhm.
great common sense advice. Well, Dr. Christian Smith, I can't thank you enough for your work over the years. Other professors like myself and many other speakers have really benefited from the work, especially really in Soul Searching, was the
Mhm.
main book I have pointed back to for years. The way I don't know if you'd ever do it again, but an approach like that with Gen Zers or the generation coming
Yeah.
afterwards, or even encouraging somebody else to do that, was
Somebody needs
just
to do it. Yeah.
somebody definitely does. The way you took a
Mhm.
philosophical and a historical and a sociological approach really, I think, was unprecedented. Now, when it comes to
Mm.
passing down the faith, there's two books I recommend. One, it's by Vern Bexton, just on faith
Mhm.
and families, also Oxford University Press. And then your book, Handing Down the Faith, which just came out. And just a
With
reminder
Amy Adamczyk.
with, thank you, you got it, with Amy Adamczyk. I think I got it right.
You did.
Uh, and just want to remind viewers that this is not like 10 steps for passing on your faith. This is for people who want to say what's happening culturally. Where does the data point about how faith is passed down across religious traditions? And what does this suggest for how we can do it practically speaking? The research data is there. So thanks so much for coming on and for doing such great work.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.